I think peanut already marked. Yeah. Okay, thank you for being there. Okay, I'll do both.
Andres, if you're speaking, you're muted.
I'm so sorry.
I'm glad you said that, Sarah. I was going, have I gone deaf?
All right, let's start over. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to this webinar, part of the ongoing series hosted by ISO Technical Committee 347, Data-Driven Agri-Food Systems. My name is Andres Ferreira. I'll be your moderator for today's session. ISO TC 347 is a new and ambitious committee working to develop international standards that enable trustworthy, inclusive, and effective use of data across agri-food systems. This webinar series is designed to explore key technical areas where standardization can support innovation, sustainability, and interoperability in agri-food systems. This webinar is part of our commitment to transparency, engagement, and inclusive participation in the standards development process. Today's topic is agricultural pesticides, from concept to registration to application, the data behind it all, and how standards can help. Pesticides are controversial, simultaneously seen by many farmers as vital tools that preserve the viability of their business, and seen by many members of the public as dangerous beyond redemption. Today, we'll explore aspects of the topic that are usually invisible, such as the process crop protection chemicals go through to be approved or rejected for agricultural use, the data involved, and how standards can help make this process faster and safer. We'll also show you how you can actively participate in shaping upcoming international standards on these topics. The session's being recorded, and we'll make it available after the webinar. And please feel free to post your questions in the Q&A box or in the chat. We'll address as many as we can during the Q&A segment at the end. We're very fortunate to be joined today by Sarah Hovinga and Monty Dixon, who will lead us through today's discussion. With 20 years of diverse experience in biopesticide and agricultural or agrochemical R&D, Sarah Hovinga focuses on advancing regulatory policy in digital agriculture with an emphasis on precision application of pesticides, including advanced application equipment, drones, and digital labeling. Sarah studied at the University of California, Davis, where she got a Bachelor of Science in Biological Sciences, and at California State University in Sacramento, getting her master's degree in biochemistry. She co-chairs the Crop Life America Drones Working Group and is vice chair of the Unmanned Aerial Pesticide Application System Task Force. Sarah also participates regularly in emerging technology forums at CropLife International, CropLife America, OECD, CIRSA, EPA's Pesticide Programs Dialogue Committee, the American Chemical Society, and the American Society of Agricultural and Biological Engineers. Sarah lives in the Sacramento area of California with her husband young daughter, and she's also an avid gardener. Now, with over 3 decades of experience in the crop protection industry, Monty Dixon has developed a unique blend of skills in residue and metabolism chemistry, human health risk assessments, and regulatory portfolio support. His career has centered around U.S. federal pesticide regulation, and key milestones in that career include becoming a regulatory manager in 2006, leading Syngenta's herbicide regulation portfolio team from 2017 to 2022. Throughout his career, he's built strong relationships with stakeholders across the agricultural industry, including industry researchers, regulatory professionals, grower groups, and government agencies such as the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the U.S. EPA. In 2022, he joined the Syngenta regulatory operations team and has since focused on driving the transition from traditional paper pesticide labels to digital labels, which we'll learn more about in this webinar. He recently advanced to the role of U.S. regulatory compliance lead for Syngenta, where he continues to champion regulatory excellence and innovation. So with that, I'll now hand things over to Monty Dixon to begin the presentation. Monty, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andres. And I'm very excited to be working with my partner, Sarah. We work together on many things, so looking forward to her presentation. Okay, now the slides are not advancing. Let's see what we need to do here. They were a minute ago. Okay, there we go. Okay, so let's start at a very high level about what is a pest. And a pest is essentially a harmful organism, is a very high level way of thinking about it. It's an organism, an insect, a rodent, fungus, microorganism, anything that has a potential to cause economic and damage, agronomic damage to crops, livestock, can threaten human health if we think about mosquitoes and disease vectors, or also can be disruptive to ecosystems. If we think about invasive species, for example, in Florida, there's been a massive impact of pythons that are not native to Florida, but when we have invasive species, these become pests that can disrupt ecosystems. Pests have significant impacts. I think the one that I most would want to highlight is the impact on food security. We live in a world that is continuing to have massive population growth, and yet we have limited resources, arable land, water, other resources. So it's really important that we're able to maximize our ability for food production in order to take care of the population and reduce food insecurity. But it also has impacts on the cost that farmers and growers bear in bringing things to market. It can have impact on human health if we think about the impact of mosquitoes throughout Africa. So pests need to be controlled, and how we do that is with pesticides. And a pesticide is a mixture of substance that's intended to try to control or eliminate a pest. These can include fungicides, herbicides, algicides, rodenticides. Also can include plant regulators, defoliants or desiccants, or nitrogen stabilizers. Essentially, if it's intended to control or eliminate a pest, it's a pesticide. And pesticides are very highly regulated to ensure both human health and ecological health. To do this, these products undergo very significant and comprehensive scientific evaluations. It's very important that these evaluations are coordinated so that we have a generally consistent regulatory framework across the world. However, it is important to realize there are regional differences. For example, the European Union tends to restrict higher risk chemicals and bans exports of chemicals not approved in their region, where the US and Canada primarily focus on risk-benefit paradigms for determining the registrability of pesticides. We see in countries like Brazil a significant increase in the interest in biopesticides. Asia also has an emerging regulatory framework. So the global pesticide regulation, while different in the different regions, all still focus on trying to ensure that these products can be used safely, not only with respect to human interactions, but also ecological interactions in the ecosystem. Now, I'm going to focus on the U.S. pesticide regulation. That's where I've spent my career and what I'm most familiar with. And I think the key message from this slide is if we think about how our agronomic practices have evolved over the last 100 to 125 years, so too is the regulatory framework that underlines how these products are brought to market and how they are used. There's a few key laws that I'll be talking about. One is the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. The other is FIFRA. FIFRA is the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. It is really the primary law that governs pesticides in the United States. A key timeline marker was the creation of the EPA, which we think has been around forever, but that only came about in 1970. Along with that, we had other major events such as the Endangered Species Act, the Good Laboratory Practices Act, Food Quality Protection Act, and the PREA Act. So the framework for the U.S. regulation of pesticide really focuses on determining whether or not a pesticide will cause an unreasonable harm to humans or the environment. So it's a risk-benefit analysis that takes into account economic, social, and environmental costs, as well as the benefits that come from the use of the pesticide. It's not just a hazard-based evaluation, but it looks at the benefits that might come from using these products. There are other laws that also go to ensure the safety framework that governs these pesticides, such as the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act and Food Quality Protection Act. These establish things such as tolerances and safety factors to ensure that these products are safe for all population. And FQPA in particular has a focus on women, children, and infants. There are also other additional regulatory acts, such as the Endangered Species Act. And through all of this, the EPA maintains oversight, not only for the initial approval of a product, but also through the ongoing maintenance, through the changes to the product while it's still on the market. And even after a product leaves the market, there are still regulatory requirements about the data that supported that use. So when we think about how a product comes to market, it really starts with a problem. There is some weed problem, some pest pressure that's creating a need to come up with a solution. And that solution starts with an idea. The idea may be a new active ingredient. And just for definitional purposes, an active ingredient is the part of a pesticide that controls the pest. So if you have a product formulation, it may have many components in it, but the one that's attributed to causing the actual control of the pest is what's referred to as the active ingredient. This idea might be either a new product or perhaps it's a mixture of products or a mixture of active ingredients, modes of actions to try to address the issue. It might be making the application to a new site, to a new crop, or it might be using a new piece of application equipment. Sarah will be talking about some of the really exciting new technological innovations that happen around product application. Might be a change in use pattern. It all starts with a problem and an idea on how to resolve the problem. It is a very time-consuming and expensive journey to bring a pesticide to market. Typically, we say 10 to 12 years and about $300 million. As you see in this funnel represents, we start with a very large number of candidate compounds. But by the time we get through this research process and we've done all the different studies, the biological screenings, the toxicology studies, all of the different evaluations that go into it, we're lucky if one makes it all the way through the process. In my career, I've been involved with developing 4 or 5 new active ingredients, and only one of them has made it all the way through. And the experiences I've had, somewhere between years 3 and years 5, there can be some scientific information that becomes available that then makes that product no longer viable. And so you have all that time and all that investment that has gone into it, and yet because the product doesn't meet the required safety profiles, it falls off and we start over. There is a large amount of data that drives this. Data really is the key to all of this, data and risk assessment. So during that 10 to 12 year journey, there will be a focus on generating biological data, xenobiotic data. Xenobiotics is a way of thinking about what happens, the metabolism or biotransformation of these products in the environment, either in the environment for respect, for example, like plants but also animals, water, soil. However, this product may change in the environment. We look at what is the potential risk from occupational, dietary. So once this product goes out there, what is the potential harm it could cause? We have to evaluate what's the fit in the commercial markets, how to develop formulations. That in of itself can be significantly challenging. You start trying to prepare these formulations and you have to take into account how do you develop a formulation that will work in different regions with different water densities, mineral content. So the formulation development can be quite challenging, but all of this comes together to the regulatory process where all these data are summarized, evaluated, processed, and submitted to a regulatory agency. In the US, it's the Environmental Protection Agency, where they do a comprehensive science review, ultimately leading to a decision. In our case, we certainly hope that they approve the label. Once the label is approved at the federal level, it still also has to then go and be approved at the state levels. And there's different degrees of regulation within the states. We have some states like California that are significantly more data intensive in their review of regulatory packages, and other states that are much less intensive. After all of this happens, the product is then able to be introduced into the supply chain and make it ultimately out to the growers. The EPA determination of these products really can be, I think, summarized in the concept of risk assessment. So when evaluating one of these potential products, the agency looks at all potential routes of exposures through dietary, through drinking water, residential, but also occupational, mixers, loaders, applicators, or reentry workers. And then also, what is the potential risk from exposure in the environment? Will it jeopardize endangered species? Will it impact habitats? So the agency has to associate and evaluate risk from all these potential routes of exposures to make sure that these products still meet the FIFRA definition of being determined not to cause unreasonable harm to man or the environment. And risk is a function of both hazard and exposure. If you have something that's highly hazardous, but you have limited exposure, you have low risk. You might have something that has very low hazard, but very high exposure, and there you still have risk. So it's really about a function of both the hazard and the exposure that determines the risk. So if we think about this venomous snake behind glass, it's very poisonous, very high hazard, but very low risk behind glass. However, if the snake gets out, suddenly the hazard potential goes significantly higher. So that's a good way of thinking about risk as being a function of both the hazard and the exposure. So how is pesticide risk determined? Well, the first thing is you have to identify what are the residues of interest. You know what you're starting with, but what do those residues become? Then you have to understand from those residues and what they become, what is the hazard or what's the risk associated with those residues? What are the critical effects? Once we determine that, then we go through and apply uncertainty and safety factors. So for example, extrapolation from one endpoint, from one species to another, you build in safety factors to ensure you take into account the differences between those species. Once you have the safety factors, you also must have to analyze what is the potential for exposure. And once you have the hazard and exposure potential, you then do sophisticated modeling to calculate what are the actual risk. And depending on the risk outcome, if you don't make the required safety barriers, mitigations can be suggested, such as reductions in rate, inclusion of personal protective equipment, potentially boundaries to where products may be applied. So once you have the calculated risk, you then may have to make sure you satisfy the human and ecological safety thresholds, if not mitigate to where you do reach the required safety levels. As I mentioned, there's the biological fate. I like to call this the what. So we start with a molecule. You know what your starting component is, but that molecule is then going to go out into the environment. It might be in plants, it might be grazed, might go into groundwater, might go into different ecosystems. So what happens to that molecule once it gets introduced into a biological system? How is it transformed? And the molecule I'm starting with here in the picture today is one many of us probably have already been exposed to this morning, which is caffeine. So if you think about caffeine, once it gets into a biological system, it doesn't just remain the parent molecule, but it's biotransformed. And this is typically done in biological systems to either secure it or to eliminate it. So to make sure that the molecule itself is detoxified once it's in a system, if it indeed does have toxic properties. So we have the fate, there's also the effects, and I like to call that the so what. So we know what a product might be transformed into, but we have to then think, well, what's the impact of that transformation? And there's a very famous quote from toxicology that I like to think about is the right dose differentiates a poison from a remedy. So all molecules have some potential of toxicity, even water. If you drink enough water, you're very healthy. If you drink too much water, you can end up having health effects from being hypotonic. So no matter what it is, there's a balance between the exposure and the benefits that come from a particular compound or a particular residue. So all of this data that gets put together, it's a very data extensive process, remembering back that this can take 10 to 12 years, hundreds of studies, hundreds of millions of dollars. All of this comes together to propose a solution for a pest problem. And that involves gathering all of this data that I just mentioned and bringing it all together to do the required risk assessments. Well, as we have these human health and environmental risk assessments, they come together from the registrant. It's submitted to the regulatory body, in this case, the EPA. They make a registration decision. And if it is approved, which is what we're working towards, a label gets approved. And the product label is the license that associates or makes possible for a product to be sold in the US. The product label is the sum of all the efforts that went in to demonstrate the product is safe. And as I'm showing in here with the red lines, once the EPA makes a regulatory decision, you get a stamp that says this product has been accepted or has been approved. That's the beginning of the process then to start obtaining state registrations and ultimately make this product available in the marketplace. The label is legally enforceable. So to apply a product in the United States, the only way to do it legally is to follow all of the restrictions that are set forth in a label. And by doing so, the use of this product then is demonstrated to be within the constraints and requirements of FIFRA and the other regulatory framework laws that govern pesticides. So by following the label, you're ensuring that you meet all of the regulatory legislation and requirements, ensuring safe use of the product. The label contains critical information. It contains first aid statements, precautionary statements, the directions for use. It includes both restrictions and precautions. And EPA is very precise on what is a restriction or a precaution. A precaution is something that is a recommendation, and that gives grower flexibilities. But if something is indeed a restriction, then it must be followed to the T, must be followed exactly. It gives specific information, for example, on storage and disposal, how to protect endangered species. So it is all of the critical information necessary to use a product. And in the example I'm giving here, you also might have even additional requirements to go beyond traditional pesticides, which is the restricted use designation. When a product gets this designation, it requires specific training and has additional regulations and requirements that govern how the product may be used. So you have your traditional regulatory approvals, but then sometimes you might have state and federal additional requirements that go on top of that. And instead of focusing on all the different components of the label, I just want to focus on one that really sets forth how the information is communicated on the directions for use. And remember, these directions for use are the result of all of the previous testing, the toxicological testing, the environmental testing. Once we have done all that testing and we get to this directions for use, it specifies how the product may be applied, when it may be applied, What is the maximum single use rate? What are the maximum number of applications? This provides a grower everything they need to know to be able to successfully and legally apply this product. And so with that, I've covered the registration process and where we're at with traditional regulatory actions. I'm now going to turn it over to Sarah, who's going to take us into the future.
Thank you so much, Monty. You did an excellent job laying the groundwork for what I'm going to cover here. Go ahead and start sharing. Hopefully you can see that okay. All right. So, yeah, Monty did an excellent job laying the groundwork in terms of all of the process that goes into research and development for a crop protection pesticide product, as well as the regulations involved. As you can see, it's a very robust process, that's been in development for 50 plus years. And while it is a very good process, there is absolutely room for improvement, especially if you think of getting into this data-driven age where we need to be thinking about digital systems. And so that's really what I'm going to cover today is where there are some of the pain points and what we're doing about them, including utilizing standards projects to digitally enable our pesticide labels for this future that we're going to. So, um, first, I wanted to start off with a little bit of the pain points, just scratching the surface here. So, Monty talked about the way a label looks and the way a label is created. And while there are standards in terms of the data and the risk assessment process that is used to evaluate that data by regulatory agencies, in terms of how company A and company B are creating and submitting those labels, that process is still different. And so that really leads to an efficiency loss for both the company submitting the label and also the regulator reviewing the label because there's not consistency between across the different companies submitting this. So there's definitely room for improvement there. When you think about a grower's field, not every grower in every part of the world, not every farmer has the same exact situation that's going on their field. And so as a result, regulators oftentimes to make sure that they're covering everything they can, oftentimes pesticides are regulated to a worst case scenario, but that really uh, leaves this deficit of what a farmer is able to do in terms of tailored applications for their specific use case and fit for purpose application. So there's definitely an improvement there. When you think of when you think of applicability of the product, again, you might have company A label looking a little bit different than company B label. So when you're talking about application instructions and directions for use, like Monty had ended on, there is this opportunity for more predictable areas for label information that can enable safer, more effective, and efficient applications. And then there's lots of interest these days, which is great in terms of how food is grown and different ways that different stakeholders might need to use this pesticide label information. But in a paper-based system, there's really not that opportunity as efficient as it could be. So when we're really talking about the future of data-driven agri-food systems, trying to get that in a format to where it's more interoperable between different systems is really the way to go. And this is really what we're aiming for. You saw the pain points on the previous slide, but this is in an ideal world. So where we're really utilizing digital tools and technologies to enable environmentally responsible pesticide applications in an increasing complex regulatory environment. So a couple things that we know, right? So agricultural technologies, if you're reading the latest headlines coming out from different publications, there's a lot of cool things going on. So equipment is highly advanced. There are sensors, models, all giving us an idea of what the real world situation is on a farmer's field, in even a specific part of their field. So we know, we have the ability to know what inputs they're applying, which way the wind is even blowing, what the potential runoff to streams to be able to prevent that is happening rather than this worst case scenario. So that's really enabling us to be able to follow the label and follow the mitigation measures that a regulatory agency is putting into place to protect human and environmental health, like they should be, to really enable this tailored pesticide application to a farmer's field while respecting the regulatory guidelines. And we'll get into this a little bit more in terms of what structured data opportunities are here, but really thinking about how to structure the information, such as pesticide labels, to really enable this digital readiness that this future state really requires, and interoperability of this agricultural information to really enable farmer decision making and respect the regulatory complexity that's required. So, and this has benefits all across the spectrum that we've mentioned before in terms of the different stakeholders. So we talked a little bit about, the efficiency of submissions for an input manufacturer, a company submitting a pesticide label, for example. In addition, it secures that the product, as best as can be done, is being, applied in the right place, in the right amount, at the right time. So really improving there. We talked about the pain points and the benefits that are there for the regulator. Regulatory agencies worldwide are experiencing, a crunch on their resources, both people-wise and funding. So as much as we can increase the efficiency while maintaining the quality is highly of interest to all stakeholders. We have the applicator that we talked about, more predictable label comprehension, improved accessibility for all communities. You think of different languages, even that this could be accessible in, for example. A grower, really being able to have that reduced complexity and enable decision making. And then we talked about other stakeholders along the supply chain really interested in this information and where their food comes from. So it's really enabling this full line of stakeholders that gain to stand to benefit from standards and the different work that's being done here. So, like Monty, I also have most of my regulatory experience in the United States. So it's not to say that this presentation is all U.S. focused, but giving an example of the complexity. And don't worry, I don't expect you to go into details on this or read the details here, but just to give you a flavor that the regulatory approval process and registration process is complex. And, while this is an example in the US, um, the same goes for other nationalities. And this one comes from CropLife America, which is the industry association in the US, and CropLife also has other organizations around the world here. But courtesy of CLA. So at least in the US, you have federal registration workflows. So at the national level, you have state registration workflows, the workflows that are actually on the paper label of the container itself. Different states have different requirements in the US. You have label information providers that are really looking to gather this information and be able to provide it to retailers down in the channels. You have the enforcement arms of the regulators, and all in all, this is making for about 18 different versions of the label. And so when you're talking about standards and single source of truth, this is a bit of a nightmare. And I should mention, a lot of this is, there are some electronic transmissions going on in this area, but a lot of this is really paper based. People are still mailing in paper registration requests, if you'll believe it or not. And so, as you can see, this process stands for lots of improvement if we're talking about digital and ability of data. Um, and then, Monty showed some pictures of the label. I took one of our labels and just screenshotted the whole label. And so this is complex, and it has the opportunity, right, to improve. There's some order there, which is great, but this is antiquated, especially if you're talking about a paper-based system compared to what the technology that we've been talking about is really capable of. And so there is this opportunity. I mentioned product A compared to product B. You might have, yeah, sure, the brand, the active ingredient, some of the safety information in different spots, but because it's required by law, at least all pesticide products have this. And so there is the opportunity to look at what these label elements are, the structure, see if there are opportunities to utilize, again, controlled vocabulary, standard phrases coming from standards projects, governance principles like rules and dependencies, and just minimizing grammatical and typographical errors. So in some cases, people are still filling out Word documents, for example, when they're doing the submissions. But if you think about, the opportunity to digitize and utilize some of these standard phrases, maybe some of these can be alleviated. And so really there is this opportunity for standardization. And so this is what the industry right now is really working towards. How can we work together to have common structures, common controlled vocabularies, and advocate to regulatory agencies to move in this way for all of our efficiencies, which is really great. And this isn't a new concept, right? I think structured digital information, it's already present in our daily lives. A good example I like to go back to is nutrition. If you open your pantry and look at the nutrition label of any of your food, it's very predictable where you can find, the amount of calories, the amount of fat or fiber, vitamins, et cetera, that are in our food. And this is, really great because it's able to give you a quick glance of your nutritional expectations of that food. But then also, if you're like me and you're trying to keep track of your food and your caloric intake for the day, you can see I took a little bit of my daughter's dinner in this case of mac and cheese. But that information, that structured information, is able to interoperate with other systems and be easily transferred. And so this concept of structured information and utilization by other platforms is a concept that we can also benefit from in the agricultural field. And just to start to tie up the presentation, we talked about the submission here, the submission side of things, but also this is really important for some of the really cool emerging technologies that are coming out. I'll give some examples of drones and sense and act systems, but also for conventional application methods. making sure that this information is available for those sorts of application devices. And one of the devices I work on quite a bit are application drones. This is a drone applying water with a dye, so you can see what the drift profile is of it, to a cherry orchard in Kelowna, Canada. And so this is an emerging technology, that's really taking off, no pun intended, in the world today, and right now being characterized regulatory wise for the characteristics that it holds. And just to give an example of what drones are used for. We have, the application drones that you just saw, but we also have the sensing and more observation drones. And just thinking along the lines of standards, you can really see how, for example, on the data collection side of drones, they're used for estimating your field conditions, seeing how your seedlings are emerging, monitoring your crop through the season, managing your water and weeds, livestock, looking at the area to be treated. A lot of these sorts of inputs or outputs are needing to be standardized so that they can be used to make decisions. And so this area is really ripe for utilizing some of these standards, because then that information is then taken and understood how to, for example, make an application or a seeding event in the field. And so this really goes hand in hand. With standards projects. And again, to the Crop Life America work that I have the pleasure of co-chairing in the United States. We've gone through a list of benefits that drones are providing in terms of flexibility, cost reduction in some cases, worker exposure reduction in some cases, an opportunity for innovation and increasing environment and sustainability profiles. And I've just highlighted a couple of the areas if you're talking about like GPS connection or the actual physical location that you're trying to treat, either if it's hard to access, if you're trying to get the application to be targeted, or you're optimizing your inputs. You need to make sure to apply, precisely. You need to make sure the application instructions are understood. Engaging other technology partners to ensure that interoperability, having this optimal timing, enabling specialty crop care and some of the smaller acreages. So all of these are again really ripe for standards and to leverage that sort of information. I didn't want to leave out other ground technologies. So drone technologies are extremely interesting and uh, taking off all over the world, like I mentioned, but there's also some very interesting standards projects that are currently going on. I'm showing one of the X665 protocols that is going on in the US right now with ASABE. And this is our station in Brazil where we're testing this. And so you can see where there are specific areas where the weeds would be. That is the only area that the tractor is applying there. So again, talking to this site-specific application ability, um, this is going away from broadcast application of a tractor and having the pesticide be applied only in the area where it's needed. And so this sort of application, again, is really enabled by these standards projects. And so really important. Um, I'm on my last couple slides here, but this is really highlighting some of the work that is currently going on in the ISO TC 347 project. And Andres has been a great leader and a great contact if you have more information about that. But everything that we've talked about or a lot of what we've talked about is being worked on. For example, we talk about, standards in the crop, The crop names, for example, being able to utilize that, for example, on a label, understanding, field operation standard, understanding, common terminologies to refer to a pest or even the stage of the crop, the mode of action of your pesticide product, the active ingredient, what formulation you're using, if there are any use restrictions, and ultimately, leading to the product label. And so you can see how a lot of what we've spoken about today, really is able to be utilized with these projects. And more specifically, this is some of the work that's going on. So, for example, Ad Hoc Group 2 is working on a controlled vocabulary and model for crops. And so that will be a really great reference data source, as well as you have ad hoc groups 7 working on field operations, 8, 9, and 10 working more on the digital side and things like field boundaries, building off of existing standards as well. And this is really, going into this opportunity that we've been talking about to standardize some of these emerging technology operations, as well as the pesticide registration submission process. So with that, I'll go ahead and hand it back over to Andres.
Thank you, Sarah. And it's great to see um, uh, you talking. It's obvious that you get to work with really cool toys, right? And that enthusiasm just shows up in your voice when you make presentations. Um, so folks might ask themselves, how could they participate? What is this TC 347 work that we speak of? Well, most of this work happens online. There are 2 plenary meetings per year where the whole committee comes together. One of those is in person. We had our first one of those this past March in Berlin. The next one is going to be in Cologne in Germany from March 9 to 12 of next year. Then we have a virtual one in October. And most of the work, though, happens in smaller groups, ad hoc groups, advisory groups, and coming soon, working groups. They meet more often, but they set their own schedule. They might meet every 2 or 3 weeks. And that's where most of the work happens. How can you contribute to that work? Well, one way is through your national standards body, where you work within the framework that your country has established. For example, in the case of the US, by joining the National Mirror Committee, or US TAG, as it's called, that's run by the American Society of Agricultural and Biological Engineers, ASABE. In the case of, say, the UK, the British Standards Institute has organized a National Mirror Committee. Same thing with Germany. Same thing with each one of the 48 members that we currently have. They have set up a mechanism for participation. And you're welcome to email us at this email shown here, or I will share my email address in a moment as well on the chat to ask how you can participate through your country and what contacts we have for you there. Another possibility is through a liaison organization. We've got currently 10 organizations from different aspects of agriculture that go from agricultural electronics in the case of AEF to agrifood systems, data interoperability and Ag Gateway, all the way to young professionals in agricultural development with YPARD, or the precision agriculture space with the International Society for Precision Agriculture and so forth. If you're a member of one of those organizations, and you can look them up in our main ISO page shown there in the at the bottom of the slide as well, you can join TC 347 as a liaison representative. Okay? So reach out. There will be a survey at the end of this webinar where you can tell us a little bit more about what you're interested in. And also, we'd appreciate your feedback about the webinar itself. Right now, let's move on to questions. We have a couple of interesting questions, and we also got some questions during the registration period. So let's go to the first one from James Lowenberg de Boer, who is the convener of TC347's own Advisory Group 3 on Responsible Innovation. He asked, in the EU, some pesticides are approved only for spot application, not broadcast. Please explain the complexities that arise when a label specifies only spot application. That's a great question.
Yep.
Sarah, Monty,
Yep. I
Yeah.
can jump in and answer. And Monty, feel free to compliment here because you might have a different perspective. I think this is a question that we're actively working on right now because it's actually a little bit of the opposite situation where a lot of pesticides are approved for broadcast application, so on an active ingredient per hectare or per acre basis. And so trying to move towards the spot application or targeted application, precision application, different regions have different vocabulary that they're using for it. It really does bring up a lot of complexities, complexities in the equipment that is used to apply it. We have to have confidence in that. That's why standards projects like the one I mentioned at ASABE X665, that project is really important to understand the machinery side of things. Then you also have the chemical side of things. So will that active, work in the way that it's intended in a spot application compared to a broadcast application? And so these are the sorts of complexities that arise just in a short way to answer that.
So let me chime in, Sarah, because in some of this, I was involved with some of this Sense and Act technology development. It really comes down back to what I was talking about, the data that underlines the registration, and that comes down to an application rate. And that sometimes is confused with volume, but it's really the rate. How much of the active ingredient is going out per unit area? That then ties into some of the data that underlines it. For example, your terrestrial field dissipation studies, your worker exposure studies. It might also come into the potential for remaining residues. So you have to have the ability to adjust the application equipment to put down the volume in the spot that you need, but you must maintain the rate. And sometimes there's been some confusing going, well, if the rate is 10 grams per hectare, can I put as much as I want in any one spot as long as I don't exceed 10 grams in that hectare? And no, you still have to maintain that ratio. That way you have the tie back to the data that underlined all of the regulatory decisions that supported that initial approval.
thank you. Let's move on to the next one from Alariza Atri in Iran. He asked, there was no mention of RNA herbicides in the presentation. Is the current regulatory system flexible enough to assess novel technologies like RNAi, pesticides, or microbiome-based products?
I think that would come down to the different regions. In general, I will say yes. But sometimes when you're going into really new areas, you may have to also have some adjustments to the regulatory framework. You may have to have, for example, science advisory panels where you bring in experts to help define, especially a novel technology. I know the RNAi in of itself, I remember hearing about that in 2007 or 8. And so I certainly know there has been some interest about that as a potential technology. In the US, I think the way that would be addressed is through the use of potential like science advisory committees or science advisory panels to make sure that the needed data is there, and then that would have to then be incorporated into the regulatory framework if it doesn't fit within, but the flexibility would be there.
Hmm. Yeah, and just to speak, because I know there was also the question about the microbiome piece, and just speaking from my biopesticide days, I know, and to build off of what you just said, Monty, there are lots of scientific discussions happening in some cases where the safety studies that have been established, for example, for conventional pesticides, maybe might not make sense for a biopesticide. And so if you have a particular bee study, it works very well if you're evaluating a chemical, but if you're evaluating a microorganism, maybe the study doesn't perform in the way that it was intended for a conventional. So I know that lots of those studies are going on to try to be flexible to other product types, again, to be in line with incorporating, sustainable solutions for the future.
Very much agree. Yes.
Thank you. We have a question from the registration phase, which was all of this sounds really great and advanced, but how is this going to be accessible to the growers and applicators that don't have access to expensive technology?
So I think one of the interesting ways and one of the important pieces of why this is being brought into standards projects is because it is then a standard that's adhered to by either the machinery or the pesticide company, whatever standards that you're talking about there. So it is, as much as possible, trying to go towards open access for this, because in order for this to work and all of these stakeholders to be connected across the chain, you really have to have this open access. And then from there, value is created. And it'll really depend on again, to the going from a worst case to a fit for purpose situation. This is really why we want to move towards this system where the farmer is enabled to make decisions based on what makes sense for their specific field. And in some cases, maybe that is really cool, interesting technology, and maybe they can afford it. In other cases, even with the drone technology, what I've seen are farmer cooperatives going in on drone purchase and drone training and certification and things like that. So I think there's a couple different ways that that this sort of technology can be accessed, and again utilizing these standards.
And let me tie in with a more of a just a real world example. There takes time, but I can remember I was incredibly excited when I got my first iPhone. I was probably 40 years old, and it was a big deal, right? Now I see 3 and 4 year old kids walking around with iPhones. So I think as technology comes and gets more widely adopted, there will also be players in the game that look for ways to make sure that they could take advantage to provide that technology to folks that maybe in the initial rollout weren't there. But I do think over time it becomes more and more widespread. And we see that in all aspects, really, of our world.
And using the phone as a tool for disseminating agronomic knowledge and for providing support for decision making for folks who might be outside the reach of the traditional human capital mediated extension model.
Yeah.
Smallholders, for example, I think is one of the
Mhm.
biggest promises of what we're doing, right? To enable that. Um, let me let me ask another question. We're almost at time. Might go a couple minutes over. I think that's okay. Let me ask another one from Alariza. That's a tricky question. Says digital twins can simulate a lot of things in pesticide registration, such as pest pressure changes, resistance evolution, weather-dependent pesticide degradation, application patterns and runoff and groundwater pathways. This could transform risk assessment, but no regulatory system uses this technology yet. Why?
Yeah, I can try to jump in and answer that real quick. I totally agree with you. I think that the technology is definitely there and capable of showing, environmental fate and effects of some of this pesticide application. Um, I think we are seeing regulatory agencies shift towards this thinking, at least in the beginning. Like, for example, again, going back to the US piece, we see some mitigation measures. But to your point, it's not yet thought of in the risk assessment process upstream, the one that Monty really highlighted very well in the presentation earlier. And so, just very practically, I think it's a matter of education, of joining through, joining project teams, giving presentations, webinars, et cetera, and making sure that there's awareness of how available and advanced this technology is. Scientific publications showing this, workshops where different stakeholders are working together, coming out with specific recommendations for regulators, making sure to get the regulator feedback to make sure that we're working on those priority areas. All of those things are happening right now because I absolutely agree that there's a lot more potential than what's being done at the moment.
And
And
there's
I think that also there's the issue with models that regulators might take a sort of cautious approach in wondering whether the model does capture all the phenomena involved, right? And uh, with biological processes in particular, they tend to be very nonlinear and are sometimes quite hard to model because maybe something that wasn't happening when you were calibrating your model suddenly happens in other circumstances and your model just can't pick it up. So I think that's one of the reasons why regulators tend to be quite reliant on statistical information rather than these mechanistic simulations.
So there's one other piece I would throw in, which is we have to sometimes think about things more as the regulators, and they tend to fall back on comforts of what they know and what they've already done. So you have to have that educational piece. But the other part is, and I'll speak specifically of the US, but I'm assuming it's the same in the rest of the world. We have to support the regulators and the regulatory agencies in that they have very, very limited resources. EPA has gone from over 1,100 people when I first started working with them in 2006 in the Office of Pesticide Programs to under 400 now. So they're doing everything they can just to meet their daily demands. So we have to educate them on the potentials these technologies offer to improve their efficiency, but they also need the resource to do that, both time, money, and people. And so that's where I would throw out a plug. They can't advocate, but I think we need to advocate for the importance of modernizing regulatory systems to give the regulators tools to make these decisions more efficiently.
There was recently a consultation by the um, European Commission about how to um, go about making their registration process is more agile as well. So this is happening on both sides of the Atlantic, right? And we have one last question, and let's see if we can give a little bit of insight here over, say, one last minute, so we can end at 5 minutes past the hour. Luis Rodriguez, he says, I thoroughly appreciate any detail you can provide regarding all the effort describing how technology enhances our ability to apply herbicides and pesticides. Then he says, can you point to unintended consequences typically associated with these technologies that may soon become a thing of the past because of our increased capabilities? So, for example, impact of classes of pesticides like neonics on pollinator populations. How are standards how is standards development catalyzing this? And so I'll just dip in very briefly by saying that Sarah showed us how complex the process of data flows in those regulatory workflows is. And um, something that complex done in the context of decreasing resources in the regulatory agency, like Monty points out, means that things might inevitably get, overlooked or not considered carefully enough. So the idea of standardizing the data that is presented and standardizing some of those workflows so that um, the um, the organization making the presentation for registration can be providing all the right data documented properly, and it can be interpreted unambiguously by the regulator, I think will make a huge difference here. And that's what we're trying to enable. Sarah, Monty, any final comments about that?
I would just add on that I totally agree, and that on the submission side would have a huge benefit to that piece. On the application side as well, I think, Luis hit the nail on the head, unintended. I don't think the company producing the product, I don't think the regulator, I don't think the applicator wants these unintended consequences, right? And so the better that we're able to have the information, the real-time site-specific information on how that product is being applied, will increase the safety, efficiency, and effectiveness of that application. So, even having systems help support in that decision making. Hey, are you sure you want to spray? It could be high time for pollination. Hey, are you sure you want to spray? It could be closer to flowering time than you intended. So all of these different things can really help to make that application. So, yeah.
Let me give what I think might be a really interesting real world example. Like I'm really excited about the see and sense or sense and act technology, but on the surface, people look at it and say, wow, that's great. You suddenly reduce how much product you're putting down on the field. So if you think about a herbicide and you're going out and you're only spraying the emerged weeds, you leave a potential for the unemerged weeds to come up. And you could be, because of potentially having some of that residual from the initial spot spray or directed spray there, a sublethal rate. So you could be potentially selecting towards resistance. And that's where you would need to make sure that when you're doing something like a spot spray or a directed spray, sense spray technology application, you're also putting in some mechanism to prevent development of resistance. So you might want to also, at the same time you're doing this targeted spray, and have a residual program going in. So that's where you think one thing is good, but if you don't think it through, you might accidentally be pushing into another problem.
True. Okay. Thank you very much, all for attending and for your questions. I also want to thank our speakers for your great presentation and answers to the questions. Everyone, please take a look at our survey. Please give us some feedback, and check our YouTube channel soon for the recording of this presentation. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.